when Christ went to the cross. He took the wrath of the divine warrior for you. The wrath that rightly would be his judgment of you for the ways that you've rejected his law and his love. Christ chose to take on himself. The curtain of the temple was torn in two the same way that Christ's body was torn by spear and nails. And what flowed out? His blood, a river rushing that cut you off from sin and death. And now you stand on the other side because of his blood. A teenage boy I know stayed up all night to write a poem about a musical. Our family enjoys musical theater, and we had the privilege of introducing two of our friends to live musical theater back in 2019. It was a father and son who were in our homeschool group. They came with a group of us to see their first musical. And the dad had no idea what the musical was about, but he was willing to drive his son. The son didn't really know either. He was just kind of interested in going to see this musical because his friends were interested in going to see this musical. But this was their first time in a darkened theater, looking at something on stage, the acting, the singing, the dancing. What was the musical? Hamilton. Right? Oh, yeah, Hamilton. The first musical was Hamilton. It's historical. It's dramatic. It's unique in how it tells the story. And both, the father and the son, were both completely blown away by it. Now later, the boy's mother told us just how blown away the son was. She told us he stayed up all night after the experience to write a poem about what he had experienced. Right? A teenage boy stayed up all night to write a poem, not about a girl, but about a musical. What is your response to the most intense experience of your life? In our passage today, Habakkuk responds to the most intense experience of his life by writing a poem, a song. Habakkuk chapter 3 is like a psalm that he left for the church as a witness to how his encounter with the living God blew him away, just like my young friend and the musical. But while our friend was surprised with wonder, Habakkuk was surprised with horror. He even becomes angry with God. Now, what's our problem? Our problem is this: we get angry at God, and then we either give up on God or we feel guilty in and of ourselves. The beauty of this passage is that Habakkuk does neither of those things. He writes this song that has one big idea, and that's this: we must act out of trust during trying times because God is trustworthy. The beautiful thing about this is that God doesn't smite Habakkuk for being angry. God stays with him while Habakkuk works through it. So if we want to learn what Habakkuk learned about God's trustworthiness, we need to look at this third chapter of this short book and see the proof of God's character, the story of God's power, and then live by faith in God's Son. Proof of his character, story of his power, living by faith. So let's start in verses 1 and 2 with the proof of God's character. Habakkuk, like I said, is this 3-chapter book. So just like last week when I said, hey, go home and read the 3-chapter prophet of Nahum, so this afternoon, go home and read the 3-chapter prophet Habakkuk. The story is divided into 2 parts. Chapters 1 and 2 are the oracle or vision, and chapter 3 is the song. And if you've ever been angry at God because you don't understand why he does what he does, then I got to tell you, this is the prophet for you. You see, most of us think that prophets are mere tellers of the future. But it's better to think of them in this way. These guys are the mouthpieces of God who do as much forthtelling as foretelling. And this is what I mean. The book opens with the statement that Habakkuk saw a vision, presumably a future vision. But after he sees it, he makes a complaint to God. He says in chapter 1, verse 1, "How long shall I cry for help? Why, God, are you making me look at violence and injustice?" You see, the prophet is forthtelling as much as he is foretelling. He's pushing back on God for the thing that God causes him to see. And God says to Habakkuk in chapter 1, verse 5, "I am doing a work in your day that you would not believe even if I told you." God says, I'm using one evil army to oppose another evil army. And then it's as if Habakkuk says to God, "Oh boy, you're right, they're evil. These are guilty men whose own might is their God." In other words, they're idolaters. They worship their own power and strength. And Habakkuk goes on forthtelling about this evil army's idolatry in chapter 1. He compares them to pagan fishermen. The evil army, the Babylonians, are going to come through and supplant the Assyrians. They're like fishermen who fish with a net, and they draw the net in and bring everything up with their hook. And then after they sell the fish and they make money and they're living in the lap of luxury, they worship their net and make offerings to it. It's like Habakkuk is saying to God, you know how ridiculous this is. This army worships itself. It's as if a skilled fisherman was to offer thanksgiving to his net for catching the fish. God, is this really your plan? One evil army swept away the northern kingdom of Israel, and now you're going to have a second evil army sweep away the first army, but then they're also going to sweep away the southern kingdom of Judah. This is the punishment you've made for your people? God answers Habakkuk a second time, and he says this, "Write it down. Make it plain on tablets. And if it seems slow in its coming, wait for it. These idolaters are puffed up, but the righteous among my people shall live by faith." And by the way, if that sounds familiar to some of you who have been in the church for a long time, the righteous shall live by faith is quoted in the New Testament 3 times. In Romans chapter 1, verse 17, in Galatians chapter 3, verse 11, and in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. But we'll get to that in a little bit. You see, Habakkuk would think that this evil army sandwich is an unfair punishment, to let idolaters overrun God's own people. Except the problem is, for a few centuries now, God's own people have also been worshiping the idols of the ancient world. But God makes this promise in chapter 2, verse 14, when he says, "The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." One way or another, the true God will be known in the world that he created. That's why God closes his remarks in chapter 2 by saying, "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." Now, with all that as the backdrop, Habakkuk opens his prayer in chapter 3. Verse 1 is a title letting us know that this is a prayer set to a musical form. And in verse 2, Habakkuk says, "I've heard of your work, and I have a reverent respect for it." And then Habakkuk goes on in the same verse to make his appeal. He says, "Lord, revive your work. Make your work known. And in these troubled times, oh, please remember that you are the God who said, 'I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy.'" It's the same Hebrew word for mercy here as in Exodus chapter 33, verse 19, a famous passage where God says that, "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy." The prophet is saying that he has proof of God's character because he knows the work that God has done. That work in the past that God has done always included showing mercy to his people in troubled times, just as much as God's work in the past has been God judging those who reject his law and his love. So, Lord, will you revive your work in these troubled times? And in the display of your wrath, will you remember your work of mercy toward your own rebellious people? And you get it? God does not smite Habakkuk for this prayer. And in praying this prayer and writing it down, Habakkuk shows us something. He shows that he has not grown bitter toward God, even though he doesn't understand his present plan. How about you? Do you believe the proof of God's character through his work? If so, it would have to be because you know the story of his power. The only way you can worship God and not grow bitter in troubled times is because you still trust him. You know the story of his power, as it says in verses 3 through 15. And the only way you can build that trust is to look back at his past work. Marriages grow stale because husbands and wives quit trusting each other. You can fake trust each other with predictability. That's when you both expect certain behaviors from each other. But I got to tell you, predictability is not trust. It's fake trust because you're not actually giving yourselves to each other. You're just predicting when you should look the other way or take defensive measures from each other. The truth is, trust in marriage is giving yourself to your spouse because you believe they have your best interest in mind and you know that you have their best interest in mind. Trust remembers how you came through for each other in the past, and trust looks for new ways to build on that in whatever new circumstance or new season of life you find yourselves in. Fake trust is a swamp. Real trust is a flowing stream. Now, I'm using marriage as a high-stakes example, but all trusting relationships have elements of what I've described. Habakkuk has a flowing stream kind of trust in God. That's why he's able to complain and to pray so boldly. And that trust is built on the story of how God came through for his people in times past. And so he prays through that story in verses 3 through 5. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. That's a poetic description of how God led his people through the wilderness after the exodus from Egypt. The places, the geographical things, Teman and Mount Paran, are in the southern part of the land as Israel came up from Egypt during those times. That's where God led them with his brightness as a pillar of cloud that covered the heavens and a pillar of fire that lit up the night. Pestilence and plague struck any who came into his presence without proper reverence. God's people learned to trust him in 40 years of wandering in the desert. Though God could have killed them all when they sinned by just zapping them all in one instance, instead, in troubled times, he remembered mercy, he showed grace, and those who trusted him grew as they followed him. Now in verse 6, God's described as the creator of the earth, the one who shaped the mountains, who measured it out. The mountains cannot stand against him. And just as the mountains cannot stand against the Creator, so also Egypt cannot stand against God, the Redeemer of his own people. And Egypt is what verse 7 references when it says, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Right? God is the Creator, and God is the Redeemer. That is the simple two-part story of God's power. God created the world, including his people. And God is redeeming the world, including his people. When you read the Bible, you are reading the story of God as creator and God as redeemer. These are the two main ways that you see God as trustworthy over and over again. He created the world in which you live. Every time you enjoy and marvel at creation, you're marveling at the work of God that He so intricately and fearfully and wonderfully made. And He also made His people in His image. And when they fell into sin, He set in motion a plan to redeem them, to bring them back from darkness to light, from wandering to home, from troubled times to mercy. In each story of the Bible, beginning in Genesis and following right up to this prophet and even beyond, especially into the New Testament and the work of Christ, you see the story of God's power that you can trust when you see God as both the Creator and the Redeemer. And one of the ways that we see God as the Redeemer of His people in the biblical story is when we see Him as a divine warrior, and that's what comes out in verses 8 through 15. I'm not going to read all of it, but you have to, if you go back this afternoon and read through this, there are 8 references in there to water. And Habakkuk ends up asking this rhetorical question, God, were you mad? Were you mad at water or rivers or the sea? And of course, the answer is no. The waters looked angry because God was using them to defeat those who would subjugate or enslave or kill His people. And in this prayer, at least 7 verbs here paint God as a divine warrior. God rode on a chariot. He stripped the sheath from His weapon. He flashed His spear. He marched through the earth. He crushed the wicked. He laid him bare. He pierced His warriors. And there are 5 different Hebrew words describing God's anger here, and that anger is always activated for the good of His people. Now, all of that, verse 13, summarizes the action of the divine warrior as Redeemer. It says, "You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed." When you know the story of God's power, you can live by faith. In our day and age, it was after the darkness of medieval Roman Bible reading that Martin Luther rediscovered God's call that the righteous live by faith. If you don't know, Luther was a monk who lived in Germany and studied the Bible, and he obeyed his religious leaders, and he went on pilgrimages to holy sites to try and earn merit that he hoped would keep him out of hell. He was afraid of leaving any sin, the smallest sin, unconfessed, for fear that he would end up in purgatory. He came to his confessor over and over again regarding the tiniest things that he thought in his mind that were sins, until his confessor actually got tired and said, "You got to quit this." And yet with all of that, Luther had no peace. He was living by merit because he had been taught that he had to earn his way to heaven. And then one day, reading Paul's New Testament letter to the church in Rome, Luther stumbles across this quote from Habakkuk, "The righteous shall live by faith." And this was no fluke, because Paul quoted Habakkuk again in Galatians 3, verse 11. "Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith." Paul, quoting Habakkuk, changed Martin Luther. And that was the spark that lit the fire that became the Protestant Reformation, which is the original Back to the Bible movement. How does Habakkuk, written sometime between 640 and 615 BC, pave the way for Paul and then for Luther? Because Habakkuk lived by faith. And here's the picture of it in verses 16 through 19 of our passage. Habakkuk says that though he has seen this vision that he doesn't completely understand, a vision that's made him physically weak, trembling, quivering, with a sense of rottenness in his bones, he will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the invaders. Having proof of God's character in the present by knowing the story of God's power in the past, Habakkuk will rest on God alone for the future. This is not a fake trust that just says, oh, well, there's nothing to be done. I just have to accept it and swallow this bitter pill, I guess. No. Habakkuk says in verse 18, I will rejoice. I will take joy in the Lord, who is the God of my salvation. He knows God as creator, and he trusts God as redeemer, and that gives him strength. And what is the picture of Habakkuk's strength in verse 19? He says, I'm like a deer. I'm like a deer that can escape trouble in the valley by jumping from rock to rock and climb up the mountains to get a higher view, away from the lions and the bears that stalk him below. Do you live by faith like Habakkuk? Do you trust God for your strength in this way and find rest in troubled times? Do you rejoice in your Redeemer no matter what season of life you find yourself in? Even if the American election for president is 37 days away, can you find strength and rejoice? You can, if you know the ultimate story of God's power and the proof of his character. That's why we need to close with verse 9 that's right in the middle of this passage. Verse 9 is kind of a weird one. It says, you split the earth with rivers. Now, it's poetry, so there could be more than one possible meaning, but it seems like this is a reference to when it rains in the Middle East. And their climate is much like ours. They have a wet season, a dry season. And, when the rain comes down in those wadis, they call them, in the Middle East, before you know it, the water can come rushing through. And all of a sudden, what was an easy path that you could cross over and back from is a rushing river, and you're cut off from the other side. You can't make it that way anymore. The land is split into two parts, and the rivers cut you off. There's a flood that the divine warrior has made that will cut you off. When Christ went to the cross, he took the wrath of the divine warrior for you. The wrath that rightly would be his judgment of you for the ways that you've rejected his law and his love. Christ chose to take on himself. The curtain of the temple was torn in two the same way that Christ's body was torn by spear and nails. And what flowed out was his blood. His blood, a river rushing that cut you off from sin and death. And now you stand on the other side because of his blood. Sin and death cannot cross over and take you ultimately. And you cannot cross back into the realm of sin and death, because his blood is the rushing river that has cleansed you. The divine warrior himself has paid the redemption price. Christ is the proof of God's character. You may know him as a teacher, but then you must know that all his teaching pointed forward to his work on the cross. And the story of God's power is the story of Jesus, who showed his strength by becoming weak. And instead of climbing the mountain, he was crucified on it. But on the third day he rose, and 40 days later he ascended to heaven from the top of the mountain. Living by faith in God's Son is knowing that he will come again to complete the work that he's begun through his people, the church. So, will you rejoice and receive God's salvation available to you in Christ? Christ is the one who will give you strength in the midst of troubled times. Let's pray.